The United States is allowing Russia to break out of its diplomatic isolation at cost free. So there are a number of unusual elements to this style of diplomacy, following, of course, a very challenging week for U.S. European relations in Europe. So the best case is that the United States is listening to the Russians to understand exactly how far they are from any type of sensible peace arrangement. And no decisions have yet been made. But it's a very, I think, disorganized, uncoordinated approach so far.
Hello and welcome to Frontline, Times Radio's interview series about the war in Ukraine and global security. I'm James Hansen, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Ambassador Mitchell Reiss, a former Director of Policy Planning at the US State Department and a former US Special Envoy to Northern Ireland. Ambassador, it's always a pleasure. Welcome back to Frontline.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here again.
Now, of course, today we have seen this meeting in Saudi Arabia between US Secretary of State Marco Rubio and the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. Ukraine are not represented at those talks. The mood music that's come out of it so far appears to be quite positive, and both Russia and the US have said they're now going to appoint teams to negotiate peace terms. But is the US selling out Ukraine by holding these peace talks without them?
Well, that's certainly the risk. There's an old saying that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And so the fact is that the Ukrainians and the Europeans were not present. And the United States is allowing Russia to break out of its diplomatic isolation at cost free. So there are a number of unusual elements to this style of diplomacy, following, of course, a very challenging week for U.S. European relations in Europe. So the best case is that the United States is listening to the Russians to understand exactly how far they are from any type of sensible peace arrangement. And no decisions have yet been made. But it's a very, I think, disorganized, uncoordinated approach so far.
I mean, it's interesting that the US have been briefing the Trump administration that this is almost a seriousness test, these early talks, to see how credible Vladimir Putin's plan for peace is and how serious he is about peace talks. Do you think there is a chance that in having these discussions, the US negotiators may realize that maybe Vladimir Putin isn't prepared to make the necessary concessions to find peace?
Well, I think that's always the chance. I think it's more likely that Putin will say whatever is necessary to get to a proper negotiating table and to reach an agreement. The peace agreement in Ukraine really isn't the issue. The issue is security guarantees so that the Russians can't rest and reload and run this play again in 5 or 10 years' time. That's what really this is all about. How can you have a sustainable peace that is stabilizing for European security into the foreseeable future?
So just to be clear on that, I mean, a lot of Ukrainians would have been hoping that some kind of negotiated settlement would lead to the return of some of the land that's been occupied by Russia since 2022, if not going back to 2014. But we heard from Pete Hegseth, the US Defense Secretary last week, that he thinks any talk of going back certainly to the pre-2014 borders is unrealistic. And I think most people think probably getting much land back from the pre-2022 borders is unrealistic as well at the moment. Do you think that as a result, it is purely down to what the future security guarantees are, and any hopes that Ukraine may have of reclaiming some of the occupied territories unrealistic now?
Yeah, I think Hegseth was both right and wrong. I think realistically he was right. I think he was wrong to say it so boldly, so publicly, so prematurely. And in fact, the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, walked that back afterwards to try to clarify that position. It was not a preemptive concession before you've even had the negotiation. But history shows us that if you haven't occupied the territory militarily, it's very, very difficult for it to be reclaimed in the peace negotiations. We saw that after World War II. So again, I always thought it was going to be unrealistic for the Ukrainians to at least at this round of peace agreement, peace negotiations, to reclaim the eastern provinces and Crimea. Again, that's to be determined. But the issue is going to be, if that's the case, how do you ensure that a frozen conflict, which is what this will become, stays frozen for the foreseeable future and allows Ukraine's sovereignty and allows it to rebuild its economy and reintegrate itself with the European Union. I think that's a much more realistic, very difficult, but a more realistic goal.
Do you think around the edges, Ambassador, there's a chance we may get some tinkering with territory insofar as Ukraine has a presence in Kursk at the moment, albeit nothing in comparison to what Russia controls in Ukraine, Russia controlling about 19% of Ukrainian sovereign territory. I think the Ukrainian presence in Kursk is about 0.09% of Russia. So you can't compare the two. But is it worth something? And do you think we will see some occupied territory being reclaimed in return for Ukrainian troops withdrawing from Kursk?
I think that was one of the initial reasons why the Ukrainians surprised the Russians with that land grab, so that they could have a little bit stronger bargaining position at the negotiating table. But as you mentioned, it's really not comparable. I think they'll try and leverage it. If they still hold on to it by the time these talks actually take place, they'll try to leverage it for as much as they can, but it's going to be difficult.
So the security guarantee, which, as you say, is really the key issue, how can Ukraine be confident, if these peace talks do come to fruition, that it will not face future Russian aggression? What, in your view, will be enough for Volodymyr Zelensky and the Ukrainians to feel secure?
Well, ideally, they'd want a NATO Article 5 guarantee, but that also is unrealistic. The Secretary of Defense took that off the table as well last week. But I'm not sure that there was much appetite in either Washington or the European capitals to extend that type of guarantee to Ukraine, at least not anytime soon. So now you have different levels of security assurances. And remember, we've had this before. From the Ukrainian perspective, they've seen the security assurances that were given in Minsk in 2015. And then even earlier, when the tactical and strategic nuclear weapons that were based on Ukraine's territory were sent back to Russia after the Soviet Union broke up. So what would it take? Peacekeepers probably would be part of a deal that would reassure Kiev. American presence there militarily. But this strange idea of actually having the U.S. be present for its business interests may actually be a placeholder for American military troops. I'm not sure that that's been thought through properly, but it seems to me that if you had 10,000 U.S. citizens there that were working in Ukraine, now they could always be withdrawn in the event of a crisis, but it would be something that would further solidify the U.S. with Ukraine's future. So far from perfect. Again, a security guarantee is best. Peacekeepers are second best. And then perhaps some type of U.S. presence there would be third best. And it's going to be up to the Ukrainians to decide what they can accept.
And when you say some kind of U.S. presence, would that be, for example, U.S. companies on the ground exploiting the mineral resources of Ukraine? Is that the kind of thing you're envisaging?
That's right. That's what Trump floated last week with a bargain for rare earth minerals. It's very 18th and 19th century, very imperialistic, very undiplomatic. But again, if this is what you can have, then it's not entirely without some value. It's far from ideal from Ukraine's perspective, and I think from Europe's as well. But it may be the best that they can negotiate.
I could understand how US troops in Ukraine would be a deterrent against future Russian aggression, but just having American contractors on the ground, is that really a sufficient deterrent?
No, I wouldn't think it would be. But I'm just saying that if that's all that's on offer, that may be the best that the Ukrainians can get, along perhaps with some European peacekeeping force. But I'm not sure that the European peacekeepers are really going to deter Moscow if they continue to believe that they should absorb all of Ukraine.
Well, this is the crucial question. What level do you need to clear where it does actually provide an effective deterrent against Vladimir Putin and future Russian expansionism? So we're saying American contractors, probably not. I mean, Keir Starmer, the UK Prime Minister, was the first European leader really over the weekend to come out and say, look, we're happy to put British troops on the ground in Ukraine as a peacekeeping force. How many that would be, given the UK army is pretty small these days by historical standards, and you may have to actually move battalions that have been pledged elsewhere, for example, Estonia. But even if you had, let's say, British and French and maybe German and Poland, well, Poland have ruled it out, but let's say Britain, France, Germany forces in Ukraine as a peacekeeping force, but no Americans, is it your view, Ambassador, that still is not enough to deter Vladimir Putin?
Well, I think that's the question. I think the Ukrainians would be very anxious about that. And let's be clear that if you deploy British troops overseas, they run out of ammunition in a week. And so it's not that there's a robust military presence there. And we saw the shortcomings of peacekeepers in the Balkans, where they were actually seized and held hostage and became part of the issue instead of part of the solution. So I'm not sure that the same thing would happen with Ukraine, but it's a concern. And so again, this is really what it comes down to. How do you deter, not only how do you end this conflict, how do you deter the next one from taking place? And that's really where all the energy needs to be focused.
And so it sounds almost like the only thing that Ukraine could be really confident would act as a proper deterrence against Vladimir Putin in the future would be having some US military presence in Ukraine. But is there any circumstance, Ambassador, that you can see Donald Trump agreeing to that?
No, I can't, at least not right now. Now there are some other things that you could do. You could provide incentives for the Russians on the other side of the table, so they get certain benefits if they refrain from remilitarizing this conflict. But again, those can be removed with the next US president. We've already seen that the Russians have a great tolerance for weathering sanctions. So it's a real dilemma. And I should just add, we haven't even talked about some of the other issues, which I know are uppermost in many Ukrainians' minds, which has to do with the morality of the ethics of war crimes and the way prisoners have been treated and the way children have been sort of expropriated from these territories and reintegrated into Russia. So there's a whole host of longer term issues, which you can put under the heading of justice, that again will need to be addressed at some point. Whether it's addressed and then dismissed or addressed in a different way is to be determined.
Given the difficulty in finding any kind of agreement that would enable the Ukrainians to feel secure and safe, how likely do you think it is, Ambassador, that actually these talks won't lead to anything and there won't be a viable agreement?
Well, I think that let's sort of separate it. I think that there's going to be talks. There's too much momentum right now. It's clear that the president wants to move this forward. And why wouldn't the Russians agree to do this as well? And the Ukrainians really have no choice. If they're going to take place, they need to be at that table. Now, then the question is, how long are they going to continue? And the problem with a lot of diplomatic negotiations is there's no real endpoint. There's no deadline necessarily that requires them to have a negotiation where it's an or else issue. So these can go on for quite some time. You may recall that with North Vietnam, the Paris peace talks went on for years. Typically, they do go on for a while. So I suspect that these talks, should they start, and I think they will relatively soon, they could go on for many, many months. And again, there's going to be opportunities for the Europeans to weigh in, even though they feel marginalized today.
I thought it was interesting that we had the Kremlin spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov, coming out and saying that Vladimir Putin is prepared to talk to President Zelensky if necessary. Do you think it is realistic that we will see, maybe not face-to-face, but certainly direct talks between the two of them at some point?
Well, I think that probably was a concession or a bouquet that they threw to Trump in order to at least suggest some flexibility. Below the level of the two presidents, I think it is highly likely. I think it's essential that the two sides will be talking. You'll have Russian negotiators talking with Ukrainian officials for sure. I think that type of meeting would probably be reserved for the last few steps of the end game. If in fact the negotiations can get there, I don't think that we're likely to see that anytime soon.
I also thought it was interesting that Peskov said that Russia is not against Ukraine joining the EU because it doesn't see it as a security threat in the same way that it sees Ukrainian NATO membership. Is that a potential Russian concession that we're seeing? I mean, when you bear in mind, for example, the Maidan protests of 2013 was sparked really by Russian opposition to Ukrainian membership of the EU. So for them, just over 10 years later, to be saying, actually, we're quite relaxed about Ukraine joining the EU, is that not a significant concession?
Well, I don't want to call it a concession because it suggests that Russia had authority over that decision, and Ukraine is a sovereign, independent country, and so it's for Ukraine to decide if it should join the EU or not, along with the EU members. But having said that, I think again it is indicating flexibility without really indicating flexibility. And so, and it's not their position to be determining what Ukraine does with its future. Again, it's sort of an interesting statement. I'm not sure exactly how much credit I want to give Moscow on this one.
No, it's a very fair point you make. I mean, on the EU membership and the benefits of it specifically, does it mean anything for Ukraine at this point in terms of its security? There are other benefits in terms of trade, etc. But if you ask most Ukrainians, you can be a member of the EU or a member of NATO. They take NATO every day. Does the EU membership offer anything in the way of security?
I think it offers a lot, but indirectly. I think that anything that creates greater ties between Ukraine and the rest of Europe is a good thing. I think anything that can help Ukraine be an economically successful country, which will be the foundation for its military, is absolutely crucial. And so it's sort of a bank shot. It's the fact that Ukraine will be less corrupt, more transparent, have the rule of law, and all these other lovely institutions that we've seen in Europe for many decades now. I think that's all wonderful for the Ukrainian people. And the fact that it can then form the basis for a dynamic economy, which will then help it support its military, that's all to the good. Again, not the type of guarantee I think that Kiev wants, but something that is very helpful for the future of an independent Ukraine.
We hope you're enjoying today's episode of Frontline. Don't forget you can also now listen to Frontline in podcast form. Just search for The World in 10 from wherever you get your podcasts, where you can also hear daily analysis of the biggest stories relating to war and defence. And we'll put a link to The World in 10 in the description below.
I wanted to ask you, Ambassador, about this sense that a lot of people have, certainly on this side of the Atlantic, that maybe the Transatlantic alliance is over, that the historical ties between the US and Europe that have really been in place ever since the end of the Second World War are starting to fray. And I think it probably is fair to say that for too long, Europe has freeloaded essentially off American largesse when it comes to military spending. And Europe has not done enough to pay its own way when it comes to its own security. But do you think this is a moment of fundamental realignment, or do you think that's overstated?
No, I think it is. And I think last week was not just a wake-up call, it was kind of a slap in the face to the Europeans in the manner in which that message was delivered. But this has to be the longest telegraph punch in history, because we can go back to the 1960s with Senator Mike Mansfield trying to introduce legislation requiring the Europeans to spend more money on defense, Barack Obama saying that the Europeans were free riders, Angela Merkel, after her first meeting with Trump, said Europe needed to do more. Macron, for the past few years, saying Europe needs to have strategic autonomy. And Trump during his campaign, saying that the Europeans need to do more, going back to the first Trump term, saying they should spend 2%. And still a third of the Europeans have not met that 2% threshold, importantly, Germany. And so 2% right now is not even on the table. It's 3% is table stakes. And I think that aside from Poland, it's essential that the Europeans rethink how they approach this issue, because it's going to require communicating to the European people, their citizens, that this is a different world right now, and perhaps it means more spending on guns and less on butter. And you can't just do that willy-nilly. You have to bring the people with you in order for it to be sustainable. And so I think the first rule is that you're going to have the European leaders understand that this is a different moment and that they're going to have to figure out ways to communicate the urgency of that to the people so that they can get public support for some of the difficult choices that are coming.
And do you believe that the European leaders have fully got their heads around that yet? I mean, we had this meeting of European leaders in Paris yesterday, this emergency summit. By all accounts, Keir Starmer in the UK is committed to increasing defence spending a bit further, overruling his finance minister. But again, they're talking about 2.5%, nowhere near the 3% that a lot of people think, as you say, are kind of table stakes to even have a say on this.
No, I don't think that they really do have a sense of urgency. The phrase is denials, not just a river in Egypt. I think they're still hoping that this isn't going to force them to make the very, very difficult decisions that they have to with their budgets at a time when the Trump administration is also threatening tariffs. So I don't underestimate the challenge, but again, this is a quality of leadership that you have to often deliver unpleasant realities to the public and figure out ways to take them with you. And, the administration in Washington did not behave as diplomatically as it could last week. And if you wanted to be charitable, you could say that this is simply the birth pangs of a new administration. And the reason I raise that is because people may forget that the Biden administration did something very, very similar right out of the gates when it took office back in early 2017. They met in Alaska with the Chinese. And Secretary of State Blinken and the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, publicly embarrassed the Chinese. And it took the better part of 2 years to get relations back on track again between the US and China, where they could even have meetings and talk with each other properly. So again, I suspect that it was a very difficult week for the Europeans to hear what they heard. I suspect that as the senior officials in Washington get more comfortable with their brief, coordinate their messages better, I'm hoping that any disagreements that we have can better be voiced in private rather than in the public way it was done last week.
But to be clear, this is not something that is purely about the Trump administration. We have reached a point of no return now because, as you explained, Ambassador, people for decades, both Democrats and Republicans, have been saying, look, Europe, you need to spend more on defense, you need to wake up, you need to smell the coffee, and we haven't been doing it. And even if a Democrat were to win in 2028, it's not going back.
I think that's exactly right. And so Trump is an easy target for people to lampoon. But in fact, he is simply the most recent in a long list of American presidents that have been frustrated with the lack of Europeans taking the measures to defend themselves in a way that's adequate with their wealth and their geographic position.
There have been some reports that Donald Trump is prepared to withdraw US troops from Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania as part of this. If that happens, does that not just imperil the security of the Baltic states at a time when you're also worried about the future security of Ukraine?
Yeah, well, I very much hope that doesn't happen. I think that would be a huge mistake on the part of the United States. I also think, as we all know, that the president says a number of things that it's difficult to evaluate how serious it might be. But I think that when the Trump team thinks through this issue, they're going to realize a couple of things. One is that it is much less expensive for the United States to base its troops in Europe. The Europeans subsidize their housing, their training. We pre-position weapons over there so we don't have to transport them back and forth. We currently don't have housing and training facilities to bring troops back to the United States. So that either means we're going to have to spend more money to create housing and training facilities for the troops we bring home from Europe, or we're going to have to cut our military, which is not what Trump wants to do. So I think that hopefully this will be self-correcting when they think through what the real ramifications are, forgetting the strategic implications. Just simply the budgetary implications of it are not going to be very attractive for the president.
I mean, the fundamental fear a lot of people have in Europe is that the way the mood music is going, whatever the deal is, if a deal can be reached, some kind of peace agreement or ceasefire, it will embolden Vladimir Putin. That he will be able to sell this at home as a win, that he will have expanded the Russian Federation through force, and he will use any cessation in hostilities to rearm, and in a few years' time, he will go again. Do you share that concern?
Well, let me unpack it, because the first one is how is this marketed? Should there be a peace agreement? And a lot of that is up to us as well, denying him the claim that this is a great victory. Let's go back to what he originally wanted to do. He thought within a few days they'd be holding a parade in Kiev after the invasion, and that the Ukrainians would just roll over and accept Russian domination again. That clearly hasn't happened. The economy has been sanctioned out the wazoo. Interest rates are now, 20%? The gas and oil lifeline that Russia has been hard hit with a cutoff to Europe. They are selling things at below market value to the Chinese and Indians in order to have some revenue. This is not a great victory. So if he wants to claim it's a victory, he's allowed to do that, but that doesn't mean he's the only voice out there. And so I think the Russian people realize this has not been a great victory. Oh, and by the way, we haven't even talked about the casualties and the hundreds of thousands of Russians that have been killed and wounded in this, which of course is going to be a living legacy that's going to outlast this phase of the war. So if we allow Putin to get away with saying it's been a great victory for the motherland, that's on us. How do we prevent it from happening again? That's really what this is all about. That's the key issue for me. How do you deter Russia from doing this again? And it could be that it really won't change until Vladimir Putin is no longer in the Kremlin. I mean, again, if we look back to history, the Korean War only ended because Stalin died in 1953. And so, again, Putin can't live forever. It may be that there's a slightly different leader in Moscow. The circumstances may be different. But this is an ongoing conflict that we hope to freeze in a way that allows Ukraine to have a fighting chance to be a successful, independent, sovereign country in the future.
I completely take your point that, it's partly how you sell, how you spin any peace agreement as to whether Vladimir Putin can claim this as a victory. It's a very valid point you raised. But is it not true that ultimately the only way you can defeat an expansionist tyrant, or certainly prevent them expanding further and risking further bloodshed, is to either defeat them militarily or at the very least punish them for their actions? And yet time and time again, we have not done that when it comes to Vladimir Putin. We didn't do it in 2008 with Georgia. We didn't do it in 2014 with the Crimea. And yes, okay, he may not have achieved the total victory he wanted, and there may not be Russian forces in Kyiv, but he has nonetheless expanded his territory through force, and he'll have gotten away with it.
Well, I think that's undebatable. And that's unfortunate for lots of reasons, both for the Ukrainians, but also for the precedent it sets for Europe, for the US, and for China, who's obviously for many, many years been eyeing Taiwan. So it sets a bad precedent. But again, how do you make sure that the price paid has been high? And if you're not going to have a theory of victory, which requires Russia to be evicted from all the territory that it has invaded, then you're just going to have to make do. Okay, it's unfortunate. Are we going to go to war over the Donbass? And I think the answer clearly has been no. We haven't even provided the Ukrainians with the weapons they needed in order to repel Russia. Again, what was the theory of victory that the Europeans and the United States had? They kept on talking about, we want the Ukrainians to win, we're going to defend them forever. But what, so that they could continue to attrit men and materiel over time? So again, that has been a flaw, I think, from the very start. Understandable, perhaps, because of the nuclear threat. That's a different issue. But again, there's been a timidity on the part of the West in terms of allowing the Ukrainians, who, after all, have been absolutely willing to fight and die to defend their territory. There's no issue. There's no question about that. But we have not been as robust in putting that message out to Putin that there is a higher price to be paid. That said, it's a pretty high price they're paying. Hundreds of thousands of Russians dead and wounded, having to conscript North Korean soldiers in order to fight. That didn't work out very well. Okay. And right now, Russia's army is a mere shell of itself. And so, again, how do you end this war? How do you preserve Ukrainian? So now you've added another one. How do you preserve Ukrainian sovereignty? And then how do you deter Russia from doing this again? And more than that, not only how do you punish them for what they've already done? And if you don't think that the punishment that they've suffered is enough, then I'm afraid that there's not a lot more that can be done.
Just finally, Ambassador, the Trump administration is aiming to have some kind of resolution to these peace talks by Easter. Do you think that's realistic?
Well, I'd like to be 6'4", James, but that's not going to happen either. No, I don't think it's realistic. I think that the first thing they need to do, the first rule of any diplomatic engagement, is they need to set up a proper negotiation that's sustainable rather than these ad hoc meetings. There needs to be a process. And I think we're seeing the early stages of that. The key question is going to be how many sides of the table are there going to be, or who's going to be sitting at the table when they convene. So is it going to be Russia on one side and then the US, Ukraine, and the Europeans on the other? Or is it going to be Russia on one side and just the US on the other side? And so I'm hoping very much that it's Russia isolated with the US, Ukraine, and the Europeans, because we're much stronger when we're together. That's always challenging because it's hard to form a consensus. But I think that united front would give us the greatest opportunity to have the type of outcome in Ukraine that we all want to see.
Ambassador Mitchell Reiss, we always appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us again on Frontline.
Thank you, James. My pleasure.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.